The diner smelled of burnt coffee and rain. Outside, the city pressed its wet face against the windows, neon bleeding red and blue across the cracked linoleum, and the wipers of passing cars made a soft metronome against the hush of the late shift. Inside, the fluorescent tube above the register buzzed like a trapped wasp, flickering every few minutes in a rhythm Elena Russo had long since stopped noticing. She noticed the ache in her feet instead. She noticed the tip jar, half full of quarters and one folded dollar bill that somebody had drawn a smiley face on in blue pen. She noticed the clock above the pie case, its second hand dragging itself forward as though it, too, were tired of this place. 12 hours. 12 hours of refilling mugs for truckers who called her sweetheart, of scraping cold eggs off plates, of smiling at men who did not smile back. Her apron was stained with ketchup and something darker she did not want to identify. Her hair, black and heavy, had escaped its knot hours ago, and now hung in damp strands around a face that had once been called beautiful by a boy in a linen suit on a rooftop in Naples, a lifetime ago, before the world had taught her what beauty was worth in a city like this one. Her eyes were the color of strong tea and just as bitter at this hour. There was a bruise of exhaustion beneath each of them, faint but permanent, the kind a woman earned by sleeping 4 hours a night for 3 years straight. In the back booth, a man in a wet overcoat was nursing his third cup of coffee and reading a newspaper from 2 days ago. At the counter, old Mr. Petrelli was eating his usual toast, dry, and a soft-boiled egg he tapped with the back of his spoon the way his wife used to before she died. The jukebox in the corner had been broken since February. The bell over the door had not rung in 40 minutes. Somewhere in the kitchen, Hector was scraping the flat top with a long, slow sound that was almost a song. Elena was wiping down the table by the window when the phone rang. It was the landline, the ugly beige thing bolted to the wall beside the register, a relic from a decade when people still called diners to ask if they were open. It rang rarely now, and when it did, it was usually a wrong number, or a supplier, or Sal the owner calling from his sister's house in Jersey to ask if anyone had come in asking about him. Elena straightened, pressed one hand to the small of her back, and walked to the phone with the rag still in her other hand. She picked up on the fourth ring. "Corner diner," she said. Her voice was flat, not rude, just emptied out. There was a pause on the other end. Not the pause of a bad connection. A deliberate pause. The kind of silence a man uses when he wants you to understand that he is deciding whether you are worth his next breath. In the background, very faintly, Elena could hear the hush of a large room, the soft click of something being set down on glass, the distant murmur of a voice saying something in Italian that she could not quite catch, but that her ear, trained long ago by a grandmother in a kitchen in Positano, recognized as a command. Then the voice came. "Listen carefully," it said. 2 words. That was all. But those 2 words arrived in her ear the way a cold blade arrives against a throat, without hurry, without apology, with the absolute confidence of a man who had never in his life been interrupted. The voice was low, deliberate, educated, and carried beneath its calm the faint grain of an accent she could not quite place, an accent sanded smooth by years of private schools and boardrooms, and yet still unmistakably from the old country somewhere beneath all that polish. It was a voice that expected the person on the other end to stop breathing. Elena did not stop breathing. She shifted her weight to her left foot, which hurt slightly less than her right, and said, "This is the corner diner. Can I help you?" "Put Salvatore on the phone," the voice said. It was not a question. There was no please. There was no introduction. There was simply the assumption, old as money and older than kindness, that the world rearranged itself on command. "Sal isn't here," Elena said. Another pause. Shorter this time. "Then find him, girl." The word landed against her ear like a pebble thrown at a window. Girl. She had been called many things in this diner over the years, some of them worse, most of them forgettable, but there was something about the way this man said it. The soft, condescending weight of it, the way it was not an insult exactly, but a classification, a filing of her into the drawer of things that existed to be spoken to this way, that made the small muscles at the back of her jaw go very still. "He's not here," she said again. Her voice had not risen. If anything, it had gone quieter. You can leave a message. I do not leave messages, the voice said. There was the faintest note of amusement in it now, and that was somehow worse than the coldness, because it meant he thought this was going to end the way it always ended for him. Listen carefully, girl. You will go into the kitchen. You will tell whoever is there to call Salvatore. You will tell Salvatore that the man he has been avoiding for 3 weeks is on this line, and that if he does not come to this phone within 60 seconds, there will not be a diner for him to avoid me from tomorrow. Do you understand? Elena looked across the room. Mr. Petrelli was tapping his egg. The man in the wet overcoat had turned a page of his newspaper. The rain had thickened outside and was now drumming steadily on the glass, and the neon of the sign across the street, the one for the laundromat that had been going out of business for as long as she had worked here, blinked its tired pink blink. Somewhere in her chest, in a place she had kept locked for a long time, something very small and very tired lifted its head. She thought of her mother, 3 blocks away in the walk-up apartment, propped against 2 pillows, the oxygen machine wheezing its patient little song, the medication bottles lined up on the nightstand in the order Elena had taught her, so she would not confuse the morning ones with the night ones. She thought of the rent envelope in the drawer beneath the register at home, $34 short, and of the note from the hospital billing office that had arrived on Tuesday. She thought of the tip jar, and the smiley face on the dollar bill, and how many hours of her life she had already spent being spoken to in exactly this tone by men who believed that the world owed them her attention. And then she thought, very clearly and very calmly, No. No, she said out loud into the phone. We close at midnight. If you want to speak to Sal, come in during business hours like everyone else. There was a silence on the other end of the line that was different from the silences before. It was not the silence of a man deciding. It was the silence of a man who had just heard a sound he did not recognize, the way a wolf might lift its head at a noise it had never encountered in all its years of hunting. Elena could hear, very faintly, the tick of a clock somewhere in that other room, somewhere far away across the city, in a place she could not picture, and she could hear the soft, slow intake of his breath. Do you know? The voice began, very quietly now, with a precision that was almost gentle. Do you know who you are speaking to? And Elena, who had not slept properly in 3 years, who had buried a father and was watching her mother follow him by inches, who had come to this country with 2 suitcases and a degree nobody here would honor, who had been polite to cruel men for so long that politeness itself had begun to feel like a kind of slow bleeding, said the only thing she had left to say. I don't care, she said, and she hung up. The receiver clacked against its cradle. The buzz of the fluorescent tube filled the sudden quiet. Mr. Petrelli looked up from his egg, his watery blue eyes curious, and the man in the overcoat lowered his newspaper 1 careful inch. Elena stood for a moment with her hand still on the phone, and she felt her pulse in the side of her neck, slow and even, and she was surprised to discover that she was not afraid. She was simply tired. She picked up her rag. She walked back to the table by the window. She bent and resumed wiping a coffee ring that had dried into the laminate weeks ago and was probably never coming out. Across the city, in a room Elena could not have imagined, a man in a black suit sat behind a desk of pale marble and looked at the phone in his hand as though it had just bitten him. The room was on the 34th floor of a building that did not advertise itself. The windows were floor to ceiling and looked out over the harbor, where the running lights of container ships moved like slow constellations against the black water. The walls were lined with books in 3 languages, none of them for show. On the desk there was a single green-shaded lamp, a crystal tumbler of something amber and barely touched, and a fountain pen that had once belonged to a judge in Palermo. There were no photographs. There was no clutter. There was only the man, and the phone, and the soft hush of the climate control, and the almost imperceptible tick of a wristwatch that was older than most of the men who worked for him. Matteo Ricci was 41 years old. He had black hair cut close at the sides and longer on top, threaded with a single streak of early gray above the left temple that he had never bothered to dye. His face was the kind that photographed badly and terrified in person, all angles and stillness, with eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore a charcoal suit that had been cut for him in a back room in Milan by a tailor who did not take new clients. His hands were long and clean and at rest on the marble. He had not moved in several seconds. In those seconds, the two men standing by the window had not moved either. They had been in this room with Matteo Ricci for a long time, long enough to have learned that his stillness was never empty, that it was a kind of weather, and that the wise thing to do when it arrived was to wait and see whether it passed into sun or into storm. The older of the two was named Luca. He had been Matteo's driver for 11 years, and his father's driver for 9 years before that. He had a scar under his jaw that he had earned in a parking lot in Queens in 1998, and he had the patient, grave face of a man who had buried more friends than he cared to count. Matteo set the phone down on the marble. The sound it made was very soft. He looked at his hand for a moment, the long fingers spread flat against the stone, and then he did something that neither Luca nor the younger man had seen him do in a very long time. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was barely a smile at all. A slight shift at the corner of his mouth, a loosening of something that had been held tight for months. But Luca saw it, and Luca felt a small cold thing move down the back of his neck, because he had known this man since he was a boy in short pants at his grandfather's funeral, and he knew that Matteo Ricci smiled for exactly 2 reasons. He smiled when something reminded him of his mother, and he smiled when something in the world had just become very interesting to him in a way it had not been a moment before. "Luca," Matteo said. His voice was the same voice Elena had hung up on, but softer now, almost thoughtful. "Bring the car around." Luca did not ask where. Luca never asked where. He simply inclined his head a 1/4 inch and turned toward the door. But Matteo spoke again before he reached it, and there was something in the tone that made Luca stop. "The diner on Arden and 6th, Matteo said. "The corner. Do you know it?" "I know it," Luca said. "Sal's place." "Sal's place," Matteo agreed. He was still looking at the phone on the marble as though it were a small animal that had surprised him by biting. "There is a woman working the counter tonight. Go and find her. Do not frighten her. Tell her that I would like to speak with her. Tell her I am not asking her to come here. Tell her I will come there, if she will allow it." Luca paused at the door. In 11 years he had driven Matteo Ricci to courthouses, to funerals, to private airstrips at 3 in the morning, to meetings in warehouses and meetings in cathedrals. He had never once heard him ask permission for anything. "If she will allow it," Luca repeated carefully, to be sure he had heard correctly. Matteo looked up then. His dark eyes in the lamplight were not cold. They were not warm either. They were something in between, something Luca did not have a name for, something that looked almost like a man waking up from a very long sleep and discovering that the room he had fallen asleep in was not the room he was in now. "If she will allow it," Matteo said. "And Luca, be gentle with her. She has had a long night." Luca went out. The door closed behind him with the soft, expensive sound of a door that had been hung by craftsmen. In the marble office, Matteo Ricci sat alone for a moment, and then he rose and walked to the window, and he stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out at the harbor, and the rain, and the slow constellation of the container ships, and he thought about a voice. Not the defiance in it, though the defiance had surprised him. Not the exhaustion in it, though the exhaustion had made something in his chest shift in a way he did not entirely welcome. It was the accent. It was the faint, buried, almost erased music of a particular stretch of coast south of Naples, a village of white houses climbing a hillside above a blue bay, a village where his mother had been born, and where she had taught him to say good morning in the dialect she would not speak in front of his father. He had not heard that accent in 15 years. Back at the diner, Elena had finished wiping the table and had moved on to the salt shakers. She was refilling them from the big cardboard canister under the counter, her hands moving in the small, precise motions of a task she had done 1,000 times, when the bell over the door finally rang. She did not look up at first. She assumed it was another trucker, another wet coat, another order of coffee and pie. It was only when the silence in the diner changed, when Mr. Petrelli stopped tapping his egg, and the man in the overcoat slowly lowered his newspaper all the way to the table, that she raised her eyes. The man standing just inside the door was tall. He was not enormous, but he took up more of the room than his size should have allowed, the way certain men do, the way a piece of heavy furniture takes up a room even when you are not looking at it. He wore a long black coat, unbuttoned, and beneath it a dark suit and a dark tie, and black leather gloves that he had not removed. His hair was iron gray and cut short. His face was grave and lined, and carried a small white scar beneath the jaw. Rain beaded on the shoulders of his coat and did not seem to bother him. He did not look around the diner the way customers looked around. He looked directly at her, as though he had been told exactly where to find her and had come only for that purpose. He walked to the counter with an unhurried step that made no sound at all on the linoleum, and he stopped at the register, and he placed his gloved hands lightly on the countertop, and he waited until she came to him. Elena set down the salt canister. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked the 6 steps to the register the way a person walks toward a phone that is about to ring with bad news. When she was close enough to see the color of his eyes, which were a pale, tired gray, she stopped, and she lifted her chin, and she said, "Can I help you?" "Miss," he said. His voice was deep and carried no threat, only a kind of formal old-world courtesy that did not belong in a diner at this hour. "Mr. Ricci is waiting. He insists." Elena's hands, which had been perfectly steady all through the phone call, chose that moment to begin a very small tremor. She pressed them flat against the underside of the counter so that the man in the long coat would not see. She was suddenly aware of every sound in the diner. The buzz of the fluorescent tube, the drum of the rain, the soft hiss of the coffee machine, the faint whistle of Mr. Petrelli breathing through his nose. She was aware of Hector in the kitchen, who had stopped scraping the flat top. She was aware of the man in the wet overcoat, whose hand had drifted quietly to the inside of his own coat, and was now resting there, very still, in a way that told her he was not, and had never been, simply a customer. "I don't know a Mr. Ricci," she said. The gray-eyed man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the lie with no offense. "He is the man you spoke to on the telephone," he said. 10 minutes ago. He is sitting in the car outside. He would like very much to come in and speak with you, if you will permit it. He has asked me to tell you that he is not here to frighten you, and that if you say no, we will leave, and no one will trouble you again tonight." Elena's eyes went, against her will, to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass she could see the long, black shape of a car that had not been there 5 minutes ago, parked with its engine running at the curb. The rear windows were dark. She could not see inside, but she felt, the way a person feels a thunderstorm approaching across a field, that someone in the back seat was looking at her. "Who is he?" she said quietly. "Really?" The gray-eyed man considered this for a long moment, as though deciding how much truth a tired waitress on a rainy Tuesday could carry. Then he said in the same grave, courteous voice, "He is the man, miss, that nobody hangs up on." And he added, in a tone so soft she almost missed it, "Until tonight." Elena looked again at the car. She thought of her mother and the wheezing machine. She thought of the rent envelope. She thought of the note from the hospital. She thought of how the voice on the phone had pressed against her exhaustion like a thumb against a bruise. And how good, how strange and good it had felt to press back. She thought of her grandmother's kitchen in Positano, the smell of tomatoes on a hot stove, the old woman's hand on the back of her neck saying, "Elenuccia, a woman who bows to every wind is not a woman, she is a flag." She looked at the gray-eyed man. She said, "Tell him he can come in. Tell him he can sit at the booth by the window. Tell him I am on shift until midnight, and if he wants coffee, it is $1.50, and he pays like everyone else." Something moved in the gray-eyed man's lined face. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, the place a smile would be on a man who had not smiled in a very long time. He inclined his head again, deeper this time, almost a small bow, and he said, "I will tell him exactly that, miss." And then he turned and walked out into the rain. Elena stood at the register with her hands pressed flat against the underside of the counter and watched him go. The bell rang softly. The door closed. Through the window, she saw him cross the wet sidewalk to the black car, open the rear door, and bend his gray head to speak to whoever sat inside. She could not see the passenger. She could only see the gloved hand of the driver on the edge of the door, and the slow rise of cigarette smoke or breath in the cold from the open interior, and then a long pause in which she understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that the man inside the car was laughing. Not cruelly, quietly. The way a man laughs when the world has finally, after a long, dry stretch, handed him something unexpected. The rear door of the Mercedes opened. A shoe stepped out onto the wet pavement first, a black leather shoe so well made that, even in the rain and the neon, it seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. Then a long leg in a charcoal trouser. Then the rest of him, unfolding from the car, with the unhurried economy of a man who had never in his life rushed for anyone. He was tall. He was not as broad as the driver, but there was something in the way he stood, a kind of settled weight that made the driver, for all his size, seem like the lesser presence. He did not put up the collar of his coat against the rain. He did not hunch. He simply stood for a moment beside the car and looked at the window of the diner, and through the streaked glass his eyes found Elena's and held them. She could not look away. He was, she realized with a small sinking feeling in her stomach, beautiful. Not in the soft way of the boy on the rooftop in Naples 15 years ago, in a harder way, in a way that had been carved by loss and kept by discipline. His face under the streetlight was pale and lean, the cheekbones high, the mouth grave, the dark hair damp now from the rain and pushed back from a forehead that carried no lines despite his age. And his eyes, even from across the sidewalk and through the window, were the darkest she had ever seen. He walked toward the door. The driver did not follow. The driver returned to the car and stood beside it with his gloved hands folded in front of him, a sentry in the rain. The bell over the door rang for the second time that night, and Matteo Ricci stepped into the corner diner, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath. He did not look at Mr. Petrelli. He did not look at the man with the newspaper, though Elena saw, out of the corner of her eye, the man with the newspaper go very still in a way that suggested he had recognized the newcomer and was making certain calculations about his own evening. Matteo Ricci looked only at her. He crossed the diner in 6 unhurried strides and stopped at the counter in the exact place where his driver had stood, and he placed no hands on the countertop, only stood with his arms loose at his sides, and he studied her face the way a scholar studies a page in a language he has been trying to remember for years. Up close, his eyes were not black. They were a very dark brown, the color of coffee grounds, with something gold flickering far down in them in the light of the buzzing fluorescent tube. There were faint shadows beneath them. He had not been sleeping well either. That was the first thing Elena noticed about him as a man, rather than as a presence, and it steadied her unexpectedly. The second thing she noticed was the very faint smell of him, which was not cologne, but something closer to clean wool and old paper, and the distant ghost of rain. And it was not a smell she had expected from a man who, the driver had implied, no one hung up on. "Good evening," he said. His voice in person was quieter than it had been on the phone. It had lost the blade. What remained beneath was the thing the blade had been covering, and the thing beneath was not cruelty. It was a kind of tired watchfulness, the watchfulness of a man who had spent a great many years reading rooms for threats, and had only recently begun to wonder whether the reading itself was the thing that had cost him his life. "Coffee is $1.50, Elena said. Her voice did not tremble. She was proud of that. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the same small shift Luca had seen upstairs in the marble office, and it had the same quality. The quality of a muscle remembering how to do something it had nearly forgotten. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew a leather wallet, worn soft at the edges from long use, and from the wallet he drew a single bill and placed it on the counter between them. It was not $1.50. It was $100 bill, crisp and new, and he set it down with the careful flatness of a man placing a card on a table in a game whose rules were still being negotiated. "For the coffee," he said, "and for your time, if you are willing to give me a few minutes of it." Elena looked at the bill. She looked at him. She did not touch the money. "I don't want your $100, she said. "The coffee is $1.50. If you want to sit in the booth by the window, you can sit there, and I will bring you a cup, and you will pay me $1.50, and you will leave a tip if you feel like it, the way everyone else does. That is how this works." There was a silence. In the kitchen, Hector had begun scraping the flat top again, very quietly, the way a man does when he is pretending not to listen. Outside, the rain had softened to a hush against the glass. Matteo Ricci looked down at the $100 bill on the counter as though he had never quite seen one before. Then, with the same unhurried care, he picked it up, folded it in half, and returned it to his wallet. From a different pocket he drew 2 crumpled ones and a worn $50 that must have been sitting in his suit for a long time, and he placed them on the counter instead. $1.50, he said, "and a 50-cent tip, if that is acceptable." "It's acceptable," Elena said. He walked to the booth by the window. He sat with his back to the wall, which did not surprise her, and he folded his long hands on the table and looked out at the rain, and at the black car, and at his driver standing in it, and he waited. Elena poured a fresh cup of coffee from the pot she had just brewed, the good pot, not the old one, and she carried it to him and set it down without spilling a drop. He did not touch it immediately. He looked up at her, and in the light from the window, his dark eyes were not frightening at all. They were only, she thought, terribly tired. "Sit with me," he said. "Please. Just for a moment. Please." The word sounded strange in his mouth, the way a foreign word sounds in the mouth of a man who has learned it late. Elena glanced at the clock. It was 11:17. She glanced at the kitchen, where Hector had gone still again. She glanced at Mr. Petrelli, who had finished his egg and was pretending to read the menu he had memorized in 1994. She glanced, last of all, at the man with the wet overcoat, who met her eyes very briefly and gave her the smallest nod, the kind of nod that said, "I am here. You are not alone. Do what you need to do." She sat down across from Matteo Ricci. Up close in the booth, with the rain on the window behind him, and the neon of the laundromat sign painting one side of his face a tired pink, he looked less like a man. No one hung up on, and more like a man who had forgotten somewhere along the way what it felt like to be spoken to by someone who wanted nothing from him. He studied her hands on the table, the short, clean nails, the small white scar across the knuckle of her right index finger where a bread knife had slipped when she was 19. He studied her face. And then, quietly, he said a sentence in a language she had not heard spoken aloud in this country, in all the years she had lived here. He said it in the dialect of a village south of Naples, a dialect her grandmother had used in her kitchen above the Blue Bay, a dialect so specific and so dying that only a handful of old women and their granddaughters still carried it in their mouths. He said, "You sound like home." Elena's breath caught. For a moment the diner around her went very far away, and she was 8 years old again, standing on a wooden stool beside a woman with flour on her forearms, and the woman was laughing at something, and calling her Elenuccia, and telling her that a woman who bows to every wind is a flag. She looked at Matteo Ricci across the booth, at the grave, tired face and the dark eyes, and the single gray streak above his temple, and she understood that this man that no one hung up on, had just handed her something that he had been carrying alone for a very long time. "I don't know what you want from me," she said. Her voice was not quite steady now. "I do not know either," he said. In English again. Gently. "That is why I came." And then, because the rain was soft against the window, and because her feet hurt, and because the night had already broken every rule she had been trying to live by, Elena Russo did something almost as reckless as hanging up the phone. She asked him who he had lost. He was quiet for a long time. He looked down at his untouched coffee. He looked at his own hands, the long, clean fingers, the heavy, plain ring on the smallest finger of the right hand, that she had not noticed until now. A man's ring, old, a signet, worn almost smooth. When he spoke again, his voice was so low she had to lean forward slightly to hear him over the rain. "My mother," he said, 15 years ago, in a fire that was not an accident, though the report said that it was. She spoke the way you speak, when she was happy, when she forgot to be careful." He lifted his eyes to hers. "I have been looking," he said, "for the people who set that fire, for 15 years. I thought I had found them all. Tonight, on the telephone, you said something to me, a particular word, in a particular way, and I realized I had not found them all. Because the word you used is a word only one family in that village ever used, and that family was supposed to have ended the same night my mother did." Elena's hands had gone very cold on the table. She did not know which word. She could not remember what she had said on the phone. She only knew, with a slow and terrible certainty, that the night was not finished with her yet, that the secret her mother had whispered to her 3 years ago in the hospital room, the secret about why they had really left Italy, and why they had really changed their names, was about to walk out of the dark and sit down in this booth across from the most dangerous man in the city. Outside, the rain kept falling. The black car idled at the curb. The driver in the long coat stood sentry in the wet neon. And inside the corner diner, under the buzzing fluorescent tube, 2 people who should never have crossed paths looked at each other across a chipped formica table and understood, without either of them saying it, that whatever came next was going to take the rest of the night, and possibly the rest of their lives. "Tell me your name," Matteo Ricci said softly. "Elena," she said, and then, after a pause in which she felt her grandmother's hand on the back of her neck one last time, she gave him the other name too, the one her mother had made her promise never to say out loud in this country. She watched his face as she said it. She watched the dark eyes widen by a fraction of a millimeter, and the long, clean hands on the table go perfectly still, and the small muscle in his jaw tighten once, and then release. And she understood in that moment that the man who had never been told no had just been told something far more dangerous. He had been told the truth. Outside, somewhere far across the city, a clock began to strike the half-hour. Inside, Matteo Ricci reached very slowly across the table and, without touching her, laid his open palm flat on the formica between them, the way a man lays down a weapon, or an offering, or a promise. And Elena, after a long moment in which the whole tired weight of her life seemed to gather and then, strangely, to lift, placed her own hand beside his. Not on top, not beneath, beside, equal, the way her grandmother would have wanted. The rain softened. The neon blinked. The night, which had been only another shift, became something else entirely. And in a booth by the window of a diner on the corner of Arden and 6th, under a buzzing fluorescent tube and the tired pink light of a dying laundromat sign, 2 people who had both been walking alone for a very long time began, without quite knowing it yet, to walk toward each other instead. Some doors, when they open, cannot be closed again. And some voices, once they say no, can never again be mistaken for silence. The name she spoke was Carrara, Elena Carrara. And in the booth by the window, Matteo Ricci heard it the way a man hears a bell he has been waiting half his life to ring. Carrara. The marble name. The name of the family who had owned the White House at the top of the village. The family whose patriarch had been a judge in Salerno and whose wife had taught piano to the children of fishermen. The family who had refused, in the spring of the year Matteo turned 26, to sign a certain piece of paper that certain men in Naples had very much wanted signed. The family who had died, according to every official record Matteo had ever pulled, in the same fire that had killed his mother, because his mother had been visiting them that night. Because his mother and Signora Carrara had been girls together on that hillside, and had stayed girls together in their hearts for 50 years, and had been drinking coffee on the terrace when the men with the canisters came up the back stairs. Every Carrara dead. That was what the report had said. Father, mother, 2 daughters. Every Carrara dead, and his mother with them, and the house a black shell against the blue of the bay. Except, Matteo's hand did not move from the formica. His face did not change. But somewhere behind the dark, tired eyes, a calculation that had been running in the background of his life for 15 years silently reached a new total. And the total was not 4. It was 3. And the missing one was sitting across from him in a stained apron, with a bruise of exhaustion under each eye, and she was the reason his mother had smiled on that last visit when she called him from the terrace and said, "Matteo, the little Carrara girl is reading Dante now, can you imagine, at her age?" The little Carrara girl. "How old were you?" he said. His voice was barely a voice. "When the fire?" 11, Elena said. "My mother took me to the market in Amalfi that morning. We missed the bus back. We slept at her cousin's house. By the time we came up the hill the next day, there was nothing left to come up to. My father, my sister, everyone. My mother did not speak for a week. When she spoke again, the first thing she said was, 'We are not Carrara anymore.' She said it the way a woman says a prayer that she no longer believes but cannot stop reciting. We took her mother's name. We took a boat. We came here. I was told never to say the word Carrara out loud in this country, not even in my sleep, not even to a priest. I have kept that promise for 20 years. Until tonight. Until you." "Why tonight?" Matteo said. Elena looked at him. The neon from the laundromat sign moved across her face in its tired pink pulse, and her tea-colored eyes were steady now, the way they had been on the phone, the way she understood they were going to have to be for the rest of whatever this night was becoming. "Because," she said, "my mother is dying 3 blocks from here, and when she is gone, there will be no one left in the world who knows the word Carrara except me. And because a man on a telephone called me girl in a particular tone, and I realized I was tired of being a flag, and because you said I sounded like home, and no one has said anything like that to me since I was 11 years old." Matteo Ricci closed his eyes. It was the first time in 11 years that Luca, watching discreetly from the wet sidewalk through the rain-streaked glass, had seen him close his eyes in a public room. When he opened them again, something in them had shifted, the way the sea shifts when the tide turns, slowly and without fuss, but completely. "Your mother," he said. "What does she need?" Elena almost laughed. It came out as something closer to a breath. "What does she not need?" she said. "A lung. A miracle. $34 for the rent by Friday. A nurse who does not look at her like she is a form to be filled out. Time. Mostly time. She will have the nurse by morning," Matteo said. Quietly, matter-of-factly. The way another man might say, "It will rain tomorrow." She will have the rent for as long as she needs rent. She will have a doctor who looks at her like she is a woman who taught piano to the children of fishermen, because that is who she is, and because my mother loved her, and because I owe your family a debt I have been trying to pay to ghosts for 15 years. And tonight I have learned that at least one of the ghosts is not a ghost. You will not refuse this, Elena Carrara. Not because I am insisting, because your mother does not have time for your pride and mine to fight about it." Elena opened her mouth to refuse anyway. Then she thought of the oxygen machine. Then she closed her mouth. "All right," she said. "For her. Not for me." "For her," Matteo agreed. He did not move his hand from the table. Neither did she. Between their 2 hands, not touching, the formica held a thin line of space that felt, to both of them, like the only honest border left in the city. "Tell me about the men," Elena said. Matteo told her. Quietly, evenly, in the low voice of a man who had rehearsed this story alone, in a marble room for 15 years, and had never before had anyone to tell it to. He told her about the paper his mother had refused to carry between 2 families, about the men in Naples who had decided that a refusal from a woman was an insult that could only be answered with fire, about the night he had landed in Rome to find 17 missed calls on his phone, and a voice on the other end saying only, "Come home. There is nothing left to come home to." He told her how he had spent the next 15 years finding the men with the canisters, one by one, and how he had finished the list 11 months ago, and how finishing the list had not felt like anything at all, had felt, in fact, like stepping off the last stair of a staircase and discovering there was no floor beneath it. Only more stairs going down into a dark he had been walking in for so long. He had forgotten there was supposed to be an end. And then, he said, the phone rang tonight. And a woman hung up on me. And I heard my mother's village in her voice. And for the first time in 15 years, I was interested in something that was not revenge. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, the fire was not only about the paper. Matteo went still. My father, Elena said, was a judge. You know that. What you may not know is that the week before he died, he had agreed to testify about a certain shipping company in Salerno and a certain set of containers moving through the port under a certain family's protection. He told my mother the night before we went to the market. He said, if anything happens, take the girl to your cousin. He said, they will come for the paper first, because that is what they will tell themselves it is about. But the paper is the excuse. The testimony is the reason. My mother remembered. My mother has remembered every day of her life. And 3 years ago, in a hospital room, she gave me a name, the name of the man who arranged the containers, the man who gave the order. Not the men with the canisters, the man behind them. She paused. Her tea-colored eyes were very steady. I have been carrying that name for 3 years, she said. I did not know what to do with it. I am a waitress with a sick mother and $34 short on the rent. I cannot walk into a police station in this city and say the name I am about to say to you, but I can say it to you. And I think, tonight, that is why I hung up the phone. Not because I was tired, because somewhere in me I already knew who was on the other end of it, and I knew that if I was ever going to say this name out loud to anyone in the world, it was going to be to the son of the woman my mother loved. Say it, Matteo said. His voice was not a voice anymore. It was a door opening. Elena said the name. It was a name Matteo Ricci knew. It was a name that sat 3 chairs to his left, at a certain long table in a certain private room once a month. It was the name of a man he had broken bread with, a man whose daughter's wedding he had attended the summer before last, a man who had embraced him at his own mother's memorial service and pressed a white rose into his hand and whispered, in the dialect of a village south of Naples, "Be strong, my son. We are all orphans together tonight." Matteo Ricci did not move. For a very long moment he did not even breathe. And then, slowly, he lifted his long, clean hand from the formica and laid it flat on the center of his own chest, over the place where, beneath the charcoal wool and the white shirt and the ribs and the 15 years of carefully maintained stillness, a heart he had forgotten he owned began, very quietly, to beat again. "Elena," he said. And her old new name in his mouth had the weight of something being set down after being carried too far, too long. "Elena Carrara, will you let me drive you home tonight? Not to take you anywhere, only to see you to your door. Your mother should not be alone for what is going to happen in this city over the next 72 hours, and you should not walk those 3 blocks by yourself, not now, not with that name in your mouth." Elena looked at him. She looked at the rain on the window. She looked at the man with the overcoat, who had quietly paid his bill during the last part of the conversation, and was now standing by the door with the particular patience of a man who worked for someone else, and had been listening more carefully than he had pretended to. She looked, last, at Mr. Petrelli, who had fallen asleep with his chin on his chest. "I need to finish my shift," she said. "I have 43 minutes left." "Of course," Matteo said. "We will wait." He rose. He left his untouched coffee. He left the 2 crumpled ones and the worn $50 on the table, and he added nothing to them, because she had told him how this worked, and he was a man, whatever else he was, who had been raised by a woman who taught him to respect the rules of other people's kitchens. He walked to the booth at the far end of the diner, the one by the pie case, and he sat down there with his back to the wall, where he could see both doors, and he folded his hands on the table, and he waited. Elena finished her shift. She refilled the salt shakers. She wiped down the counter. She woke Mr. Petrelli gently and helped him into his coat, and walked him to the door and watched him cross the wet street to the walk-up, where he had lived alone since 1994. She went into the kitchen and told Hector that she was going home, and that tomorrow she might not be coming in. And Hector, who had heard enough from the pass-through to understand that the shape of the world had changed in his diner tonight, only nodded and said, "Be safe, mija," and pressed a paper bag of leftover bread into her hands for her mother. At midnight exactly, she untied her apron. She hung it on the hook. She took her coat from the peg and put it on, and she picked up the paper bag of bread, and she walked to the booth where Matteo Ricci was waiting, and she said, "I am ready." He rose. He did not offer her his arm, because he understood, without being told, that she was not a woman who would take an offered arm tonight. He walked half a step behind her to the door, and he held the door for her, and the bell rang for the fourth and last time that night, and together they stepped out into the rain. Luca was already opening the rear door of the Mercedes. Elena paused on the wet sidewalk, and she looked up at the black car, and then she looked at Matteo. 3 blocks, she said. You could walk it with me. Matteo looked at the car. He looked at Luca. Luca, who had driven this man through 11 years of marble rooms and private airstrips, and had never once in all that time seen him choose the sidewalk over the back seat, inclined his gray head a 1/4 inch, and closed the rear door again without a word. He would follow at a distance. He understood. Matteo Ricci turned up the collar of his coat, finally, and offered Elena Carrara nothing but his company, and together they began to walk. They walked the 3 blocks slowly. The rain had softened to a mist. The streetlights made long gold pools on the wet asphalt, and their footsteps, hers in tired sneakers, and his in handmade leather, made a small, unmatched music on the sidewalk. Neither of them spoke for the first block. In the second block, Elena told him about the piano lessons her mother used to give, and the smell of the lemon trees behind the white house, and the name of her sister, which was Chiara, and which she had not said out loud in 20 years either. Matteo listened the way a man listens who has been alone with silence for too long. In the third block, just before they reached her building, he told her, very quietly, what he was going to do over the next 72 hours. He did not ask her permission. He told her because she was a Carrara, and because the debt was hers to know about, and because he had decided, somewhere between the booth and the sidewalk, that he was never again going to handle a name from her family without her knowing it. Elena listened. When he was finished, she said only, "I do not want blood. I want the containers. I want the testimony my father was going to give. I want his name on a piece of paper in a courtroom, not on a headstone in a ditch. Can you do it that way?" Matteo Ricci considered this for a long moment under the misting rain. It was not the way he had done things, ever. It was harder. It was slower. It required trusting people in suits instead of people with guns, and it required letting a man who had kissed him at his mother's memorial live long enough to sit in a chair and answer questions. "Yes," he said finally, "if that is how you want it. I can do it that way." "Then that is how I want it," she said. They stopped in front of her building. It was a narrow walk-up with a rusted fire escape and 1 yellow window on the 4th floor, the window she had left lit for her mother. Elena turned to face him on the stoop, and under the misting rain her face was tired and young and unafraid, and Matteo Ricci thought, with a small clean shock, that he had not looked at another human being and felt afraid for them in 15 years. "Tomorrow," Elena said. "The nurse, the doctor, those things first. The rest can wait until my mother has someone sitting with her who knows what she is doing." "Tomorrow," Matteo agreed. "At 7. I will send Luca. He is gentler than he looks, and he knew your mother's village by name before I did. She will like him." Elena nodded. She hesitated. Then, because the night had already broken every rule she had been trying to live by, she did one more reckless thing. She reached out and, very briefly, laid her hand flat against the front of his coat, over the place where he had laid his own hand against his chest in the diner, and she said, in the dialect of a village south of Naples, "Thank you for coming," when I hung up. Matteo Ricci did not move. He let her hand rest there for exactly 2 seconds. Then Elena turned and climbed the stoop and let herself into the building, and the door closed behind her, and he stood alone on the wet sidewalk for a long moment, looking up at the yellow window on the 4th floor. When the light in it did not go out, when instead a second light came on beside it, and he knew she had gone to her mother, he turned and walked back to where Luca was waiting with the Mercedes, and he got into the back seat, and he said, "The office." And one more thing, Luca. Call the lawyers. Not ours. The honest ones. The ones in the white building on Pearl Street. Wake them up. Luca, who had spent 11 years driving this man to meetings that honest lawyers were never invited to, glanced once in the rearview mirror and saw, in his employer's face, something he had not seen since the summer before the fire. He saw purpose that was not revenge. He nodded. He pulled the car away from the curb. The wipers swept the mist from the windshield in slow, steady arcs. The next 72 hours moved the way weather moves when a front finally breaks. By 7 a.m, a woman in soft shoes and a soft voice was sitting beside Elena's mother in the walk-up, adjusting the oxygen and humming a tune from a hillside above a blue bay that the old woman had not heard in 20 years. By 9, a doctor with gray hair and kind hands was explaining in Italian what the next weeks would look like and what could be made easier and what could not. By noon, the rent envelope in the drawer was no longer $34 short, and the note from the hospital billing office had been quietly intercepted and paid by a lawyer in a white building on Pearl Street who had been woken up at 1 a.m. and told that an old debt was finally going to be made good. By the second day, a sealed envelope had been delivered to the office of a federal prosecutor who had been trying, without success, for 4 years to build a case against a certain shipping company in Salerno. Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents that Matteo Ricci's mother had hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace of the White House on the hillside. Documents that had not burned because the stone had protected them. Documents that Matteo had recovered 11 years ago and kept locked in a safe because he had not known, until a waitress said a name out loud in a booth by a window, what they were actually worth. With the documents was a short letter, handwritten, unsigned, giving the prosecutor 3 other names and one specific date on which a certain long table would be set for a certain private dinner, and suggesting, with the dry courtesy of a man raised to respect the rules of other people's kitchens, that the prosecutor might find it useful to know where that dinner would be held. By the 3rd day, the man who had embraced Matteo Ricci at his mother's memorial was sitting in a small gray room across from 2 federal agents, and he was not being offered a white rose. Elena did not see any of this. Elena spent those 3 days in the walk-up with her mother, and for the first time in 3 years, there were hands in the apartment that were not hers, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept more than 4 hours in a row. On the 4th morning, her mother, who had not been strong enough to sit up unassisted in weeks, asked to be helped to the window, and looked out at the narrow slice of sky above the fire escape, and said in a voice like dry paper, "Elenuccia, who is the man?" Elena told her. All of it. The phone call, the diner, the booth, the walk home, the dialect of the village, the name she had given him on the Formica. Her mother listened with her tea-colored eyes, the same eyes Elena had inherited, fixed on the sky. When Elena was finished, the old woman was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Bring him here. I want to see the face of Lucia Ricci's boy before I go." Matteo came that afternoon. He came without Luca. He came in the same charcoal suit and the same long coat, but he took the coat off at the door and he left his shoes on the mat the way he had been taught as a child, and he walked into the small bedroom where Elena's mother lay propped on 2 pillows with the oxygen line at her cheek, and he stopped at the foot of the bed and bowed his head, and he said, in the dialect of a village south of Naples, "Signora, I am Lucia's boy. I am sorry it took me 15 years to come." Elena's mother looked at him for a long moment with the terrible clear sight of the dying. Then she lifted one thin hand, and she beckoned him closer, and when he bent down, she touched his face the way a woman touches the face of a son she has not seen since he was small, and she said, "Your mother loved you very much. She said you were too quiet. She said she was afraid the quiet would eat you." "Has it?" "Almost," Matteo said, quietly. But it was interrupted. The old woman smiled. She turned her tea-colored eyes to her daughter in the doorway, and she said, "Elenuccia, a woman who bows to every wind." "Is a flag," Elena finished. Her voice was thick. Her mother's hand moved from Matteo's face to his hand, and then from his hand to her daughter's hand, and she joined them, very simply, on the thin blanket over her knees. the way she might have joined the hands of two children at a village wedding 50 years ago. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. She closed her eyes and slept, with their joined hands still resting on the blanket, and the oxygen machine wheezed its patient song, and outside the narrow window a sparrow landed on the fire escape and looked in at the three of them and flew away again. Elena's mother died 11 days later, in her own bed, with a nurse who knew her village holding one hand, and her daughter holding the other, and a photograph of a white house on a hillside, propped on the nightstand beside the medication bottles. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was a quiet one. Matteo was not in the room because he had understood, without being told, that the last hour belonged to the women. He was in the kitchen of the small apartment making coffee the way his mother had taught him, and when Elena came out of the bedroom with her face wet and her chin very steady, he set the cup down and he opened his arms, and Elena Carrara, who had not allowed herself to be held by anyone in 20 years, walked into them and stayed there for a long time. A year passed, then another. The man who had embraced Matteo at his mother's memorial stood trial in a federal courtroom, and the testimony of Judge Carrara, preserved in his own handwriting behind a loose stone in a fireplace on a hillside above a blue bay, was entered into the record, and the name Carrara was spoken aloud in an American courtroom by a prosecutor who did not know that a waitress in a stained apron was sitting in the back row with her hands folded in her lap. The shipping company in Salerno was dismantled. 3 other men, whose names had been in the short handwritten letter, went with it. No one was found in a ditch. Elena had asked for it that way, and Matteo Ricci, who had never in his life been told no by anyone, had discovered that being told no by the right person was the first thing in 15 years that had felt like being told yes. He did not become a different man overnight. He did not become a good man by the standards of men in white buildings on Pearl Street. But he became a man who answered his own telephone. He became a man who walked the 3 blocks from his marble office to a small apartment above a bakery, where a woman with tea-colored eyes was learning, slowly, to play her mother's piano again on a second-hand upright he had found in a shop in Brooklyn and had delivered without a note. He became a man who, on Sunday mornings, sat at her kitchen table in his shirt sleeves and read the newspaper while she made coffee the way her grandmother had made it, and who, when she set the cup in front of him, always said thank you in the dialect of a village south of Naples, because it was the only dialect in which the word had ever really meant anything to him. Elena did not go back to the corner diner. Sal sold it to Hector a few months later, and Hector renamed it and put a new coat of paint on the walls and fixed the jukebox, and the fluorescent tube above the register was finally replaced. Elena went back to school instead. She finished the degree her country had refused to honor. She took a second one, in law, at a university in the city, and she paid for it herself with a scholarship and a part-time job, because although Matteo Ricci would have paid for anything she asked for, she had told him on the stoop in the misting rain that some things a Carrara paid for with her own hands, and he had never once, in all the time that followed, tried to argue with her about it. On the evening of the day she passed the bar, she walked from the courthouse on Pearl Street to a booth by the window of a small restaurant he had chosen for the occasion, and he was waiting for her there in a charcoal suit, and on the formica between them, under a candle instead of a fluorescent tube, he placed no $100 bill and no folded papers and no proposal of any kind. He placed only his open hand, palm up, the way a man lays down a weapon or an offering or a promise. And Elena Carrara, who had long since stopped being tired in the way she had been tired on the night she hung up the phone, placed her hand in his. Not beside it this time. In it. Equal still, because they had learned how to be equal, but no longer afraid of the small warm distance between. Outside, somewhere far across the city, a clock struck the half-hour. Inside, a man who had once been told that the quiet would eat him looked across a candle-lit table at a woman whose voice had reminded him, on a rainy Tuesday, at 11:17 at night, that the world could still surprise a man who had stopped expecting to be surprised. And he understood finally what his mother had meant on a terrace above a blue bay the summer he turned 26, when she had laid her hand against his cheek and said, "Matteo mio, one day someone will tell you no, and on that day you will know that your life is finally beginning. Some doors, when they open, cannot be closed again. Some voices, once they say no, can never again be mistaken for silence. And some debts, the oldest and quietest ones, are not paid in blood or in money, but in the slow, patient work of sitting across a table from the one person in the world who knew your mother's name in the dialect she only spoke when she was happy, and learning, one ordinary evening at a time, how to be happy in it too.